One of the myths of Zionism is that there's always been tension and conflict in Israel-Palestine, or that the tension between Isaac and Ishmael has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, as if conflict between Jews and Arabs is inevitable. And we know that's not true.
It's so hypocritical now when you hear people say, Zionists say, that the Muslims are anti-Semitic. I'm going to come to that, because really, when you look back, the most horrific anti-Semitism has been in Europe. And when there was severe persecution in Europe, typically places of refuge were in Muslim lands.
In my view, there is one key to almost complete understanding, and that is knowledge of the difference between Judaism and Zionism. So let's look at them separately. Judaism is the religion of Jews, not the Jews, because not all Jews are religious. And like Christianity and Islam, Judaism has at its core a set of moral values and ethical principles. What is Zionism? Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism. It's a colonial enterprise which created a state for some Jews in the Arab heartland, mainly by terrorism and ethnic cleansing. And in so doing, it made a mockery of Judaism's moral values and ethical principles. In reality, Judaism and Zionism are total opposites. Well, most Europeans think that Zionism came about because of the Holocaust. I mean, that's complete nonsense. Zionism is a colonial enterprise.
Theodor Herzl, an Austrian Jew born in 1860, is commonly credited with being the father of Zionism. Zionism is an idea which basically says that Jews need an exclusive Jewish state. This idea came about as a reaction to European and Russian anti-Semitism. Zionism was formally launched in 1897. Once they decided where this state was going to be, Palestine, they started to migrate Jews there. At the onset of the century, the region was under Ottoman rule, and later on under British rule, and so the Zionists found their way into British politics to facilitate this plan. For example, the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Originally in 1882, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 3%.
I would say that with the coming of the second wave of Zionist settlers in 1905, came the group that developed the ideas that would later form the basis for all Zionist and Israeli strategies. They came with the idea that this is now the place where all the Jews have to come to. And this is the place that has to be exclusively Jewish. And it's quite amazing in a way, because they were themselves about sort of 3% of the population, and yet they regarded the other 97% as irrelevant to what's going on.
Zionism, when it came into being, it was very much a minority. Most Jews in the world, from Zionism's launch in 1897 until the obscenity of the Holocaust, most Jews in the world were opposed to Zionism.
The leaders of the movement were seeking a territory and were not focused on Palestine. You know, they had several options: Uganda, Argentina, and they discussed them very seriously. People forget it. You need to be an historian to remember these things. Uganda was, in the eyes of the founding father of the Zionist movement, Herzl, a much better option than Palestine in a given moment.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he did consider it. I know it was offered.
No, he was in favor of Uganda. He was in favor of it.
The British, in a sense, started the whole catastrophe, set it in motion with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which supported the establishment of a Jewish entity in Arab Palestine. Now, leave aside the fact that Britain had no right to give away what it didn't possess. The fact of the matter is, there were a number of reasons for that declaration.
The Balfour Declaration, it promised the Jews a homeland in the British Empire. It didn't promise them a state or independence. It was a homeland. The Balfour Declaration was written by the Zionist organisation for the British government. There was dialogue going on between the Zionists and the British government.
Originally in 1882, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 3%. Through migrations, by 1917, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 10%. By 1947, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 30%. In 1947, UN recommended the partitioning of Palestine. Arabs who owned about 92% of the land, with a population of 70%, were offered 43% of the land. Jews who owned 8% of the land, with a population of 30%, were offered 57% of the land. Arabs refused. A year later, in 1948, Israel declared itself a state on 78% of original Palestine. It did this through massacres, expulsion orders, and fear tactics, destroying more than 400 villages, making more than 700,000 refugees who fled to Gaza, West Bank, and neighboring Arab countries. 150,000 Palestinians remained inside the new state of Israel. In 1967, Israel exerted full control on the remaining 22% of Palestine.
What really made it happen was the Holocaust, because of course this was something very appealing to the European conscience. People felt that Jews had to have a refuge, and they had to assist them, and so on. Now, of course, the irony here is, if they felt so strongly about it, why didn't these Europeans give Jews refuge in their own countries? And of course, they didn't want to, not in my backyard. It's an extremely skillful, clever fabrication by a very sophisticated Zionist propaganda machine, which created this idea. Of course, it's nonsense.
I mean, there is no link at all, as far as I understand, I mean, genetically speaking, between the Jewish people now living in Palestine and those who left it in antiquity.
The people who came and took over Palestine were Europeans, East Europeans most often, Poles, Lithuanians, Russians. These are people with their own history of conversion from their own religions to Judaism, and then they began to believe themselves to be the Jews connected to the ancient Israelites, and of course that's nonsense. The Palestine issue is about one very easy to understand fundamental fact. It's about dispossession, meaning that an alien people came and took the homes and possessions of the Palestinians and expelled them. That, in essence, is the whole conflict, the whole reason for the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians.
The scene is near Jericho, one of the camps for Arab refugees. The story is one of destitution. For these people, as the result of the war in Palestine, have either fled or been expelled from their homes and their livelihood.
A total of 750,000 Palestinians had been exiled, kept apart from the rest of Arab society by governments which had reluctantly offered them refuge. These exiles were left to brood on their fate, dependent upon relief agencies for their survival.
These camps were not very far from the Israeli border. Certain refugees could see their village on the other side, and they were still thinking, we will return, we want to return. In their heart, they all had the wish to return. And they couldn't imagine that they would live in such a situation of refugee for years.
جينا من سلوان جينا هان سكننا في خيمة وما فيش مطرح اللي مثل ما تقول يعني اللي واحد يقعد لا في دار ولا في بيت ولا في شغلة. خيام، جابوا لنا الوكالة خيام وسكننا في خيام. بعدين احنا عيلة يعني الخيمة كانت تسعنا. صرنا ندق طوب طينة من هذا الطوب ونبني. سوينا بيتين هيك إن اللي يسعنا احنا العيلة. وقعدنا فيهن. ومو هذاك يوم وهذا يوم واحنا هان ساكنين يعني.
كيف عشت يعني؟
وشو بدنا نسوي غصبا عنا شوية من الوكالة يساعدونا. شعوري كانت منهارة. شو شعوري؟ كيف اللي بدشر ملكه وداره وأراضيه ورزقه وبيجي هان يقعد في أرض صحراء. ما غصبا عنا شعورك بدها تنهار يا الواحد.
Having lost the struggle for the land, the Palestinians were now written out of its history.
There's an underlying thread of reluctance within the Zionist movement and in Israel to come to terms with the existence of the Palestinian people. This goes back right to the very beginning of the Zionist movement when someone coined the slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. The Jews being a people without a land, and Palestine presumably being a land without a people, which was a very neat symmetry, except for the fact that there was a people in the land of Palestine, the Palestinian people. And therefore the existence of the Palestinians rather spoilt this symmetry, and that existence had in some way to be denied or played down or overlooked.
Within, I would say, half a dozen years after the establishment of the state in 1948, a whole constellation of, to my mind, ideological fictions gained currency in Western political and intellectual discourse, so much so that 40 years after the fact today, in 1988, with the revelation to the West of what in fact happened in 1948 and the history of the early years of the state, and all of that has not begun to even dislodge this. It's remained a kind of canonical myth, or set of myths, or constellation of myths in Western society that has extracted from the Palestinians a massive price, and we're still paying that price.
Hidden behind these myths and expectations lies the history of the indigenous people of the area, the Palestinians. Here people were engaged in commerce and industry. The cities were proud and vibrant, and it was here that there was the greatest exchange of ideas with the West. Schools, colleges, religious societies helped encourage the development of a middle class with a conscious sense of a Palestinian identity. Political influence was still concentrated in the hands of a few traditional families. By the early 20th century, there were the first stirrings against Turkish rule amid a general awakening of Arab nationalism. At this time, there was no separate Ottoman province of Palestine. The area was subdivided into several districts, all administered from Beirut and Damascus. The total population of Palestine amounted to about 500,000 Palestinian Arabs living in some 800 villages and in a score of cities and towns. For generations, the Palestinians have been primarily a settled people, living in villages and farming the land. The main activity was the citrus industry, and the principal trade was the export of oranges through Palestine's major port, Jaffa. The majority of Palestinians were Muslims. There was an important Christian minority, and there had always been small communities of Orthodox Jews. But in the 1880s, the first Zionist settlers began to arrive from Europe, inspired by an entirely new type of movement. As a political movement, Zionism was born at a time of intense European nationalist rivalry. Founded by a group of Jewish intellectuals, the Zionist movement looked to the acquisition of land in Palestine as the first stage in the creation of a Jewish state, as a refuge from centuries of persecution. Wealthy European Jews like the Rothschilds financed the building of early Zionist settlements in Palestine. Zionists began to settle on the land that was special to them. The seeds of the conflict over the land of Palestine in modern times were sown.